Good morning. Welcome again, listeners and viewers of our Election Science Office Hours webinar and podcast. We're hosted by Caltech's Lind Center for Science, Society, and Policy and moderated by me, Mike Alvarez. This again is a webinar and a podcast, so you can watch it on YouTube, you can listen to it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or you can do both. You can find the entire archive of what we did in 2024 on the Caltech Election Integrity Project website. It's also on the Lind Center's website. You can also find it at protectingtheelection.us. We're on social media too, so you can check us out on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, X, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Paul Manson's already laughing. So anyway, today is going to be a lot of fun. I'm really excited about this. The guests we have today are longtime friends and colleagues, and of mine and certainly of each other because they've worked closely together. So we have Paul Gronke and Paul Manson from the Elections and Voting Information Center, known as EVIC. That's what we'll call it today. They're with us today. So first, a little bit about EVIC. EVIC is a nonpartisan academic research center that's been around for over 2 decades. One of the longer lasting research centers in this space, and particularly proud of the Pauls for getting it going and maintaining it over the years. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. The EVIC's research leads are co-located in the Portland area at Portland State and Reed College. EVIC is led by the founder and director, Paul Gronke, and research director, Paul Manson. And EVIC really tries to work to find common sense, nonpartisan solutions to, real election administration problems backed by solid empirical evidence and scientific research. The marquee project that EVIC conducts, which we'll talk a lot about today, is the annual local election official survey. And they've been undertaking this survey since 2018. It's a pretty remarkable survey project. And again, we're going to talk quite a bit about it today, the background, how they do it, but importantly about some of the really cool research that I think the three of us think can come out of this vehicle. So Paul Gronke, professor of political science at Reed College, who studies American politics with a specialization in convenience and early voting, election administration, and more generally, public opinion and elections. And as I said earlier, Paul is the founder and director of EVIC. And, under Paul's leadership, EVIC, has become a national center for excellence in this area of election science, policy research, and, publicly engaged scholarship in election administration, election reform, and election integrity. Paul Manson is a research assistant professor with the Center for Public Service at Portland State University, and Paul is the research director at EVIC. His election administration research explores the workplace budget and management challenges that election officials wrestle with. And Paul has a particular interest in understanding what draws individuals to serve in election administration and what communities have access to serve in this critical role. And this is a very important problem that we've heard quite a bit about in recent months. So, Paul, welcome to Election Science Office Hours. Thanks for being here today. And we're going to talk a bit about the past, present, and future of the EVIC Local Election Official Survey, EVIC more generally, both how you got into this area, and kind of what you see on the forefront as what's really important for us to be thinking about and recommending to the community for research problems as we look ahead to 2026 and 2028. Those election cycles, the midterm election cycles effectively are already starting. So let's start with the local election official survey project. So you recently released your latest report just last month on the 2024 survey. What are you excited about this particular survey?
You need to address which Paul, Mike. So I'll lead off here.
Yeah, go ahead. Can I start with?
We started one of these and someone said we need to change our names first.
We're going to go with beauty before age. So Paul Manson.
No, I'm going to say, Mike, what I was really excited about was, I want to say getting it done, but that it's still working. We made a decision this year to push the survey a bit later, to ask the questions closer to the election. We always have to navigate with the election officials and having the capacity and willingness to respond to our survey. And, we've really been honored that they participate over time. But no matter where we conduct a survey, we're bumping into someone's election. And we've been told that quite pointedly at points. Why did you send this to me now? Don't you know I have a primary? And the primary season runs pretty lengthy. So we were fielding in August, September, and even a little bit into October. And so one thing is excited that we got responses during that period. The other thing I'm excited about, and we're going to potentially dig into this a little bit later, is that for the first time we worked with other teams of researchers. We'd done that before on an informal basis when we knew people had a research trajectory that we could support and include some questions. But this time we had more official relationship with them, and some of that work is really quite exciting. We've begun to roll some of that out. We had a policy brief that came out last week on public records requests. We have more rolling out over the next couple of weeks as well. So it's just really exciting to engage other people in a kind of a semi-official capacity and helping to participate in the project.
Paul Manson?
Yeah, Paul's right. I mean, we're thrilled that the response rate was what it was as we experimented with getting close to the election. And because of that, I think we have a little more currency in the data. So, asking questions in May, June, or July versus August, September, October. So for the LEO survey this year, we started the first week of August, and we're collecting surveys through a couple of modes through October. The story for me out of this is, this is our we've been running the survey since 2018, but this is the first time now we've got two presidential data points. Granted, 2020 is a very unique year on many levels, but I don't know if that there are normal years anymore. So we've got two sort of presidential data points, and we saw a real drop off in some key metrics about the experience that local election officials are having doing their work. And that sort of in contrast with the public perception of the 2024 election, where we had quick, speedy results. The conclusion of the election was clear, and there weren't a lot of the questions I think a lot of us were bracing for, right? I remember in the lead up, we were all warning folks, election night is just election night. It's not actually where we know everything always, but lo and behold, we did. So the piece here we're really keeping an eye on is, because we have that sort of calm surface, so to speak, on the election results, what's happening underneath? What's the turbulence there? And I think we see that in some of our items around the job satisfaction and intent to retire or leave the profession. And so those are continuing to look worse. But on the surface, things appear to be functioning well. And so I worry about that disconnect, especially going into this next policy cycle, where we may not have a strong federal set of leaders to engage some of these real big national challenges.
Right. So let me go back to I'm just going to go with last names to get rid of the Paul part. So let me go back to Gronke. So you mentioned this is the first time where, with the survey project, that you work directly with a number of academic teams. Can you talk a little bit about how you put that infrastructure together, and really why it was important for this particular iteration of the survey?
Sure, Mike, and thanks. How we put the infrastructure together. Well, that I think we learned, and there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of emails. Paul Manson fielded a lot of that work. Part of the infrastructure was that we had one colleague in particular, Dr. Lisa Bryant at University of California, Fresno, I think, has been on an earlier office hours, that received a Carnegie fellowship to look at the relationship between election officials, their constituents, other stakeholder groups, and the emergence of election denialism or skepticism, and sort of how officials navigated through that world. So we've had collaborative relationships with Lisa before on a number of projects. And so I believe, Paul, I think we might have proactively reached out to Lisa and asked whether she wanted to include some items. We had other teams that had relationships with our primary funders, Democracy Funding Elections Trust Initiative. So we were connected with a group at the University of Florida, the Breckner Center, University of Florida Law School, I believe, doing work on public records requests. We worked with the Election Reformers Network, that we had an ongoing relationship. They had been, Kevin Johnson of that group had regularly been saying, why don't you ask this question? It was like, okay, we're going to give a shot here. David Kimball and Hugo Liao. Hugo is a assistant professor at University of St. Louis. David has been an advisor on the survey for a number of years, and so we reached out to David. Did I miss anyone? I feel like I'm missing one person from the list, Paul. But really, what we did, Mike, was say, look, we'd like to give an opportunity to demonstrate the value of this instrument, and kind of what topics are you working on that we can help you, help us,
Mhm.
and help the community more broadly. So, everybody asks for lots of questions. It's a lot of like, slow down, we don't have that much space. So it worked okay. I think if we institutionalize it, we need to think a little bit more. Mike, it's hard for me with Mike because we've known each other for a very long time. But way back in the day, when I was a graduate student at University of Michigan, they established the first advisory boards while I was there in the 80s. And that was difficult. The reason was because the National Election Study had become a bit too much of an insider's game. And I think they weren't providing access to external scholars. It's not easy. When you have a valuable instrument like that, lots of people want to ask lots of questions. So we're really at the initiation of that phase. It's gone really well, though. Some of the stuff that people have asked worked very well, and some of it is really dynamite work.
Mhm. Excellent. So let me go back to Manson. You mentioned one of the results from the survey, which is job satisfaction. Other than that, which I'm happy to talk about that, job satisfaction. So maybe we should talk about that one. But also any other key and particularly interesting findings from the 2024 survey. Love to hear.
Yeah, and maybe just build a little bit on Paul too. One of the other components around why we had this partnership, and it'll lead into one of the sets of questions I'm excited about. There was through the Bipartisan Policy Center a pretty big call for applications research projects about a year ago. And we learned sort of from that by talking with BPC, a number of the teams said, hey, we are going to write this grant to partner with EVIC to get onto the survey. So what's sort of interesting there is that this sort of the survey has become a bit of infrastructure, and now that those teams are sort of coming to us as well that way. So Paul mentioned some of the folks we reached out to, but others are now saying, hey, we want to sort of find a way to plug in our questions on there. So, along those lines, some of the key pieces that jump out for this year, obviously we'll come back to job satisfaction, but the threat and harassment environment continues to be problematic, with folks, sharing a lot of experience. Over half have some sort of threat or harassment experience in the last year. And the results of that are a number of them are saying, hey, we're scaling back how we engage the public. About 30% say they're doing that. And about the same number, half are also saying we're changing how we do our work in response to those threats. So that's something that's really of concern. And I'm just mindful too, as we see sort of departure of CISA and some of the cybersecurity and threat analysis from the federal agencies, that's now going to shift to the states. And so the question is that capacity there? Some of the other pieces, one of our teams, Paul mentioned, Hugo and David at University of Missouri, St. Louis, they're getting to something that I've been wanting to do for a while that we haven't had a chance, which is public service motivation. So really trying to test what motivates local election officials to do this work, and more importantly, stay in this work. And I know Dave and Hugo are going to share this in just a few weeks on our blog, but they've been doing some modeling around the relationship between these public service motivation measures, right? And these measures are questions about sort of how dedicated or how people frame their work in terms of creating public value versus the personal reward of the job. And that there is some really interesting relationships between job satisfaction, intent to leave, and these public service motivations. So that's exciting to see. Another piece that we added this year that's new is Paul and I had a chance to speak with almost every election official in Oregon about a year ago, and we realized, wow, this revenue side of the budget question is a really interesting space. Great work being done, Martha Croft and Zach Moore, on a lot of the budgeting and budget side of elections, but we really got interested in this revenue side. So we asked for the first time a series of questions, and it's a little bit tricky, but asking local election officials to tell us the mix of revenue types that they use to support their office. And we see some interesting camps emerging there. You've got the local offices that are dependent on taxes within their county or local jurisdiction, and another camp that are really driven by negotiated reimbursement rates, whether that's from the state election office or from the jurisdictions they operate for. And so these two different models are out there, and they both have their sort of external threats, whether that's macroeconomic shocks to the tax base or We've heard a little bit anecdotally that some negotiation of the rates may be motivated not necessarily by the true cost of elections, but by the perceptions of what elections should cost.
Mhm.
And so some of the challenges that election offices may have going forward on that revenue side of the equation.
So let's talk a little bit about satisfaction.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised to learn that job satisfaction is going perhaps down among election officials, given the threat environment in particular, the immediacy of that, but also the other challenges that they face. So how have you quantified that in the survey, and what are you finding in terms of specific subpopulations of election officials who might be hit hard and who might be really seeing their job satisfaction drop considerably?
Yeah, Paul, let me talk about some of the high level ones, and then you should share, I think, getting into that subpopulation piece. So, if we look over the multiple years that we started asking job satisfaction questions in 2019. I'll own this. We added a bunch of component elements of job satisfaction, but in 2019 we didn't just ask them, "Are you satisfied?" So we
Mhm.
have some nice components there. In 2020, I realized, oh, we should really have those components and tie it to just a general satisfaction question. 2020 was a high watermark in the job satisfaction. So I think we were just above 90%. We're saying they were satisfied or very satisfied. And then that drops down about 20 points over time as we come to present and sort of going down and down. So, this is the good news is the majority of folks are satisfied with their work. So that's good. And the question is sort of where should we have that number? And we know that public service has been hammered on, it's not just local election officials, but public service in general. When we dive into what we do is we ask a number of sort of constituent questions about what would maybe inform job satisfaction. So, feeling respected by your county peers in county government, that's been a good measure. That's been high and staying stable over time. But then we have a couple that are more about the personal toll and questions like, can you leave your work at the workplace? Can you balance home and work priorities? Would you encourage your child to go into election administration? All of those are rapidly declining over this time period. And the child question in particular went down about half from 2020. So only 20% now would say, hey, I think my son or daughter should go into this line of work. So that is a trend here that is falling as we go forward. And I think, on the flip side, what we see then is folks who are reporting a desire to retire or leave the profession has been climbing over the same time period, where in 2020, of those that weren't thinking about retirement, 10% said they were ready to leave before the next presidential. Now 25% say they want to leave before the next presidential. So these stresses are having some impacts on that rate of turnover. Paul, I know you've been exploring too, sort of more in detail, what might be driving some of those from a jurisdiction perspective.
Yeah, and thanks, Paul. Yeah, there's a broader topic here, Mike, which is you roll out an instrument like this, you roll out these kinds of results, and sort of all of the researchers that work in this area have to navigate how it is to report information about this community. Because while there are 8,000 election officials, there are 50 states in the District of Columbia. And then even within states, your own state of California, you've got one jurisdiction at one end with 6.5 million registered voters at this point. And I think the other end is Shasta. I may be wrong about that, with the thousands, Mike. I may be low on that, right? So trying to navigate that diversity is hard. So we rolled out the numbers that Paul referenced, and my assignment is to write a blog post to do a deeper dive into job satisfaction. And true story, I start digging at it because your person that works is helping to support Michelle Schaefer at Magenta Sage works with us. And if you don't keep on time with Michelle, she makes sure you keep on time. So I've got to write something for her. First thing I do is I break the data down by our jurisdiction components, and I send a late email to Mike and to Paul and Michelle. I'm like, did I do something wrong here? Because this is serious. So when you take that overall job satisfaction number and look at it by jurisdictions, the big decline after 2020 was dominated by the very large and the very small. The very small dropped about 30 points. The large is about the same level. The medium sizes, that is 25 to 50 and 50 to 100, dropped about 15. So what's happened now by 24, Mike, and we'll see this in about a week or two when we release it, is the large and the next two have they've dropped. It's about 15 points,
Mhm.
but the smalls are still going down. I don't want to say it's collapsing, but the line is going down over time. Now, what that means for anyone who uses our data, you just have to understand this about the data. Under the hood, it's really important when you're using the data from our survey to not just look at the code book that we release with the overall numbers, but look at the crosstabs that are broken down by jurisdiction size to make sure that there's nothing going on underneath the hood, because those smaller jurisdictions are also geographically concentrated in a small number of states. And a number of those states are also battleground states that have been hotspots for election denialism, for extremely partisan elections. And so unpacking that is complicated. So what I'm going to say more about this on our blog in a couple of weeks, but something is going on with these small jurisdictions. And they are really the larges and mediums are experiencing it as well. But boy, the decline that we've seen in the smalls, Mike, is got to raise a red flag, and there are worries there. So I want to say one last thing in that respect as well, that from the 24 survey response to this, we asked questions about ability to hire. And there's a good news. On poll worker recruitment, we're seeing officials saying things are doing okay to well. But hiring full-time staff, so we said before, well, people are leaving. Well, of course, then you hire a replacement, right? Except officials are telling us overwhelmingly, and again, Mike, we've known each other this long. When you ask a survey question and you've got a Likert scale, a 5-point scale, and you only get 1 or 2% in the agree categories, your first response is, what did I mess up?
Right.
Or, oh my Lord. And this one was an oh my Lord moment. Yeah, on the hiring of full-time staff, what is it, Paul? 2% say it's gotten easier? It's just none. Everybody is having a difficult time hiring staff. And so, you know, if we're going to be replacing this generation of election officials and we can't hire people, again, we've got a real problem.
So let's talk a little bit about the methods just for a few minutes, because I think, you know, people probably have a misconception. They think something like this is really easy to do, right? Like, you know, I think the idea is, well, you just set up a website and election officials, you know, will come and fill out a survey. And we all know that's not the reality. So how do you actually get a sample? Do you sample the entire universe, the entire population? And how do you proceed to get election officials to come fill out your survey, or fill it out if you send it to them? In particular, how do you get them to trust you that you're going to analyze these data in some appropriate way?
Yeah, it's complicated. It's very complicated. Paul is going to provide, I think, I'll let Paul provide some more of the excruciating details. I will say that at the outset, there's no single list of election officials, so we don't have a population list. I've often, not completely tongue-in-cheek, referred to the Minnesota problem. Like, I know you have some links to Minnesota. The Government Accountability Office, in a number of their reports, looks at the sub-jurisdiction township level in Minnesota. In our work, we look at the county level. And that's the difference that folks will see out there between 8,000 and 10,000. We have to assemble that list. We start with the jurisdiction list from the Election and Administration and Voting Survey, the EVES from the Election Assistance Commission. And then we have to reach out through personal contacts to append information from Michigan, because EVES reports at the county level in Michigan, and we need the township and jurisdiction, township municipality level. So we build that list, and we just have to go. We do some web scraping that's gotten more difficult over time, and then we go through, and I spent a lot of time with spreadsheets, looking at places where we knew we were missing key elements, and just going to find things. So it's not easy. The other thing I'll say about this community in terms of surveying it, it's not a large community. I don't know how many election officials at this point I know personally or professionally, but it's not a small number. So it is not anything like a mass sample survey. We want other people to use the survey. I'll talk about this at the end. We really want to make the data available, but de-identifying this data is not easy. And so we've been honored really to have trusted partners that we've worked on the academic side who've really honored the need to keep the data confidential. But yeah, when the survey goes out, people know, right? The word goes out when the survey goes out, and the good side is we start to field questions already. The bad side, maybe some of the questions are quite pointed. People that don't know us and want to know what we're doing. So, Paul, I'll hand it off to some of the excruciating.
Oh, I mean, I won't make it excruciating. I mean, I guess if here, I like to think about this as a cookbook, for those of you who are interested in how we do this, how would you replicate it? And Paul's really captured, the real challenge, right? In the sampling world, we think about this frame. Where are we going to get a list of folks to send something to? And our unit of analysis is really sort of squishy, right? A local election official seems like a simple category. And in some states, we're lucky it is. In other states, it's a little mix. There's shared duties in terms of whether they're handling just registration and maybe early voting, or they're responsible for election day and the following procedures. So we have to make some choices right away that we're going to call on a local election official, someone who manages basically election day voting for sure, and then some other pieces in the election process. So those are some distinctions. In some states, you've got partisan representatives that share it. You've got Democratic and Republican local election officials. And so we have to make some rules about how we're going to settle that. And it is interesting, Paul mentioned, so we'll start with a master list of offices, and then we have to go find people. That's who we're actually going to send the survey to. I would say 4 years ago, even, the ability for us to find that available on the web was relatively easy. And so Paul mentioned, we were lucky. We've got some smart undergrads who helped scrape that with scripts. Over the past 4 years, security implementation has pulled that back. So finding contact information for the individuals we want to get to is not as easy as it used to be. We can always get the office address physical, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but finding the emails in particular has been a challenge. And so, we pull a sample. It's a weighted sample. We have a probability-based sample. So what we're doing is we know that there's a lot of these very small jurisdictions. Paul's already hinted at that with Wisconsin and Michigan, but also New England and Texas have sort of a larger share of the local jurisdictions. So if you're a jurisdiction above about 15,000 voters, we'll definitely include you in the sample, sort of the way we've written the probability piece. And then as it gets smaller, we'll start sampling probabilistically, declining as that population shrinks, so that we don't have a huge sample just dominated by those small jurisdictions. And then what do? Well, Paul sort of downplayed how much work it takes, but that list to send to is months of work, and it changes every year. So once we have that list, we do start out with a web survey, so everybody gets an email inviting them to join. And Paul's right, especially over the past few years, phishing concerns and then knowing who we are have lowered the response rate on that web component. But I'm also thankful we've luckily been doing this long enough that in some states, especially on the West Coast, Colorado, North Carolina in particular, folks are aware of us. And so they've been quick to respond. And what we do, the sort of gold standard for us is we'll have the survey in the field as a web instrument for about 3-4 weeks, doing follow-ups, trying to help folks out. And then we'll pause and send out a physical copy. And so what we do there is we invite folks they actually have a chance. They can, now that they've seen the physical instrument, they can go back to the web and take it if they prefer to do that, or they fill it out there in the paper version. When we do that, it's about half and half. So half of our sample that comes back will be web-based, the other half will be paper-based. And jurisdiction size sort of predicts which one's which. The larger jurisdictions are more likely to take the web survey, and the smaller ones are going to be showing up in the paper survey. So I think that's a key thing, too, for others that are thinking about researching really governmental units in general. The smaller jurisdictions are either going to be unsure of what you're up to because they're not in the professional networks, or they're more cautious. And so you really do need to think about sort of that Dillman total method approach, right? Really finding different ways to get at these populations. This year was the first year where I had a number of local election officials calling my research office here on campus to make sure I was real. Folks were sleuthing my LinkedIn and telling me, okay, I found you, you're a real person. I had a number of phone calls. Hey, could we just talk about what you're up to and why? And all of them, once they had a chance to do that, were happy to participate, but definitely more scrutiny this year.
Great. And I want to just emphasize something here for folks, because it's really important that folks know that what you're doing here with this methodology that you've constructed, right, is you're really building a scientifically valid sample, right? So by building this survey firm, putting all of this energy into developing that list, which you then sample from, right? You're then doing a probability survey, which is really what we think of as the gold standard of scientific surveys. And so I want people to realize that all that work that we were just talking about is incredibly important, because then it gives us a representative sample once you construct the appropriate weights. And I think that that's really what is really remarkable about what you guys have built here. Is a true scientific sample, not only just for election officials. We don't really talk about political science and public administration. We know very little about people who work in any county or municipal office. And so I think that this is a really valuable example about how we could go about building similar instruments to study, other types of public administration, in particular at the local level. So I just wanted to pat you both on the back for that.
Yeah, and Mike, I want to chime in here that there is our discipline, political science in particular, also public administration. There's been real advancements in my and Mike's time in the political science, which is getting on 30 years, I think, for both of us. Whereas when we first entered, right, I tell people, like, when I came in the 80s, election studies meant spin the tapes, right? That literally put the NES tape up and spin it. But an article about election was about the national election. Paul's seen this, I do this PowerPoint a lot, like, how many election jurisdictions in the United States? And I start with, is the answer one? Is it right? But that for a while was the answer, right, Mike? And then there's been a lot of it. Part of it's computational. Part of it is the impact of HAVA and allowing reliable statewide voter files that allow people to get leverage on that. I do want to call out, I'm going to pronounce the name incorrectly at the end, Mike, but Justin De Benedictis Kestner, is that correct? And Warshaw at George Washington. Justin is at Harvard at the Kennedy School. Eric McGee at the California Public Policy Institute. There's really good work being done at state and local, and we're getting there in terms of understanding who these are and doing the surveying. I need to come up with there's a female professor at Texas who does work, another one now at Vanderbilt that was at Merced. I need to come up with these names, but there is really good advancement being done in the state and local, and we're really glad to be part of it. But we're really following the lead of a lot of those other scholars who are doing such. But yeah, the lift, Mike, is hard. Right. There's a lot of local governments out there. Paul, how many local governments in the United States? 10,000?
Well, you get all local, state, and federal, 90,000, right? So you've got a lot of units.
Quite a bit. So what's the response rate in the most recent iteration of this for the survey?
We were just at 21% this past year. And so our high water mark has been about 30% in some years where we have a longer field period in the summer.
Excellent. Well, good work. So let's start with Gronke on this one. Let's talk about the origin story here. Where did this particular survey project come from? I can speculate, but I want to hear it. I want to hear your version of the origin story.
I'm looking at your question, and you're supposed to say don't talk for 45 minutes. I'll try to be brief. I'm going to
keep 45 seconds. How's that?
45 seconds. I'll exceed that for sure. I'll give you two versions. One is literally the real actual origin story. Folks that don't recall this, haven't been in the space as long. There was a large investment in the space in 2008 called the Make Voting Work program. Michael Caudle-Fagan and Doug Chapin and some others invested in this space. They moved away from the space around 2012 or 13. I think that's about right. President Obama at that time, around then, established a Presidential Commission on Election Administration. Among the members of that committee was Tammy Patrick, who had been in Maricopa County. This is going to end, believe me. So they issued a number of recommendations. This is how we all started learning about line length. Professor Charles Stewart did some very innovative work. Nate Pursley, who's at Stanford now, ran that research team. And so a new nonprofit had been created, Democracy Fund. And one of the things they looked at was elections. They brought in as the head of the elections team, Anna Ambrosi, who had previously been working on the Hill, I think on the Senate side for he was in whatever Schumer's committee was at that point, and he'd been their election specialist. He was brought on. I sort of knew Adam a little bit, and this really, in some ways, the initiation goes back to whatever that Spanish tapas place is in the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago at the Midwest meeting. Anyway, I'm having, that's what you do with the nonprofit. You wine and dine with them, and you're talking with them. And Adam paid the bill, of course, because he was with this foundation. but they needed some help to figure out where they should invest their resources. A program officer at that point, Natalie Adona, who is now the clerk recorder in Nevada County, but Natalie at that point was working with Democracy Fund, and Democracy Fund at that point was very into this strategic planning practice called systems mapping. So my first assignment, I was brought on as scientific advisor, and my first assignment was to work with Natalie for, I think it might have been about a year, 6 months, to try to figure out, could we map the election administration space and help Democracy Fund figure out where to strategically invest their resources. You can still find that map. Search for Democracy Fund Election Administration Systems Map. And the only reason, I already want to say, the only reason I say that is I look back at that map now, and I've talked with Natalie about this. We did really good work.
So Paul, this is a chronology.
Yes, I know it is. So what happens,
just-
we identify the areas. We're not going to, I say, trust in God, trust. Voter turnout is going to be hard. Ending political gamesmanship by legislatures, that's going to be really hard. But election administration, think investment in election administration can really make a difference. And then there's this moment, we don't know when it happened. We both, Natalie and I have talked about this. We realized there had not been good surveys in this space since the CRS surveys a decade before. There'd been some work, great work in Wisconsin, Barry Burden, David Kimball. So then they came to us and said, look, next step, can you start to do this survey? And that's really how it started, was just the realization that we'd identified a space where we thought strategic investments could occur, but we didn't know anything about the space. And then we launched. And that's all they wrote. I will say one thing, 2020 came, we'd been doing this work, and suddenly we were the cat's meow. Suddenly, election administrators were under massive scrutiny. And you know what? There was this project that had been collecting data over time. And I think that's really what launched us kind of in the national spotlight.
Yeah. Well, what my memory of this goes back a little further than that, which is that, what I think happened here was that, you and I both spent a lot of time working with the EAC. You mentioned their survey, right? The data that they collect, which is really not a survey, it's more kind of a census is what I would call it. And I remember that you and I once wrote a report that, pointed out that there's a lot of things that they're not asking and they're not collecting data on about election officials. And I remember you at one point when we were doing that, saying that what we need is we actually need a survey, okay, of election officials. And again, CRS was doing some work here. People were doing work in the States, but I think that the, moving this to a truly scientific survey at the national level is really a great accomplishment. So, Paul Manson, how did you get into this?
Yeah, I don't know if I can follow up with sort of the Homeric epic that Paul shared there with the catalog of ships, but what I'll say is,
Jason,
it's a lot social networks, right? So I'll start out with sort of the intellectual interest, which is, for years and years, I've been doing work in public administration around local government work, sort of exploring whether it's funding challenges, sort of how to do provision of public services. And so part of that was a survey methodology. And so I had some tools, had done work with different jurisdictions in the Northwest, and Paul and I were chatting about the local election official survey, and he'd run some bumps in the road trying to figure out how to make the survey work better and increase response rates. And so I started sharing some advice and was roped in sort of that way, to be honest, and started working with Paul. And then at the time, some other colleagues that were developing the survey. The other sort of avenue for me, which is always sort of happy chance, I would say, is the Center for Public Service here where I sit is in the Marco Hatfield School of Government. And we sort of act like an extension service if you're in the agricultural world to local governments. We're always sort of doing support for them and research for them. And the director at the time for us was our former Secretary of State, Phil Keesling, who implemented vote by mail here in Oregon originally. And Phil had just this voracious appetite for data around elections. And so it always sort of walked down the hall to me. He saw that I had R up and I was working on something. And he said, "Hey, can you run something at this voter file?" I said, "Oh, these are neat data. I've never played with these before." And so part of the other hook for me was this sort of data science interest, which is the elections data is a fun puzzle to work with. And then I would say just the third piece, lastly, in my training, I did a lot of work through science and technology studies. And so I'm always really interested in these questions about how the public perceives the sort of scientific integrity of elections or how they perceive the transparency of governmental actions, because it's a black box in many ways, and we choose parts of the election black box to reveal and other parts that we keep secret. And there's some interesting sort of philosophical questions there when it comes to governance. And so those things sort of pulled me in, but really at the end of the day, Paul needed some help. I knew Paul from other good connections, and I found it really interesting and joined the ride.
Well, I'm glad you joined because you're a fantastic addition to this election science community. Now we're running out of time. I knew this was gonna happen. We've got so many things I wanted to talk about. We're gonna have to do another episode of this, but so a lot of people who will check out the podcast or check this video out once we put it online are likely to be scholars working in this area. I've found actually with some of these past episodes that we've done that, a lot of the junior folks pay close attention to things that people like you say, in particular about this unique data. So what would you like if you had a couple of young, advanced undergraduates or PhD students who wanted to dig into these data? What are some really interesting things you think they should explore?
Well, I'll share just a couple pieces really quickly. One of the things is I think Paul and I have been so focused on collecting these data annually, and we report out some of the top lines and some crosstabs to try to help the policy space make sense of what's going on out there. But Paul, 2 years ago, we were sort of joking at the Southern Political Science meeting. I think Mara Sutton Lee and Leah Marabaki were the first to sort of actually take our data and try to do some modeling work with it. We'd never really done anything more than descriptives between Paul and I. We haven't had the time. So I would just say that there's a wealth of information here that we're working on identifying the best way to make available to the broader community. And that's an IRB set of questions. But I think that I'm excited that as some of the other scholar teams have come in, they're really bringing methodologically more tools to these data, where Paul and I have been just so focused on collecting these data that we haven't had a chance to sit and do some of the really cool heavy lifting that can happen on the back end now.
Okay.
Yeah, I would chime in with the same thing, really. There's an opportunity now to start to track change over time. We have measures. Paul was we have 2 midterms and 2 presidentials. What we have not done as much work on is attaching other metadata and other indicators to the survey to try to see whether some of the patterns we are looking at are broken down by different election ecosystems, by whether they're battleground states or not, partisan balance, things like that. We simply have not had the time and capacity to do that. So I'm looking forward. We're starting to do some of that now. I'll just preview that I'm working with a scholar who's the survey director at the Brennan Center, and they ran an LEO survey themselves where they used a different sampling technique, which was to send a broadcast email to everybody that they had on the list. And so Sarah Rinfred, it might be, Sarah and I are working on a paper for APOR to try to evaluate what the different approaches come up with. And then the teams that are working on the Election Science Reform Administration Conference coming up in Tallahassee, Lana Atkinson is running. We're partnering with them. Academic partners, in a way, are sort of easier because once we get them under the IRB umbrella, we have those protections, and they're obligated to honor the confidentiality protections that we have. So we really do encourage groups, if they see something in the crosstabs or code books, contact us. We could, Michael Ritter, a scholar at Washington State University, is doing a chapter in a book looking at Wisconsin, and I provided to Michael a code book for Wisconsin. Said, hey, let's talk. We're moving the PII, personal identifying information, but we're trying to open it up to people as much as we can.
Great. Manson, you have more to add?
No, I think that's right, and I'm excited. Really, maybe you opened up talking about sort of looking ahead, and maybe what I'd say is that's the piece also I'm really wanting to pay attention to is what are these measures going to look like, and what I expect will be a wild midterm. And I just whatever happens in this year, we want to keep an eye on the sort of budget constraints. So as states are facing, we know states across the U.S. are facing statewide budget headwinds. If we're looking at some macroeconomic shifts in the U.S. economy that might impact those sorts of revenues, what will that do to local election officials? And this sort of departure of federal partners in many spaces, is there the capacity or tools to replace that? Will local election officials feel like they have tabletop exercise resources, security resources, cybersecurity resources? Those are some of the big questions going forward. And so we hope to be tracking those as we start work on the next round of survey questions.
Oh, the survey just keeps getting bigger and bigger, doesn't it? More and more stuff to add. So, Gronke, we know that you've got a book. Can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, Front Lines of Democracy came out on Springer a couple months ago. I'm really proud to be able to work with a lot of emerging scholars and other teams. Some of them worked with the LEO survey data, others brought in some other data that they're working on. But yeah, it was a great experience. Many of the names you've heard here already are in there. We got materials on demographics. We've got Paul Manson has done some work with Grace Gordon and Bridget King on making the diversity and kind of recruitments in the profession. We've got Christian Gross at University of Southern California, who's got some work on philanthropy. Barry Burden, Jess Esplin, graduate student, had work on Wisconsin. Igor Gann and Josh Ferrer from UCLA are doing some work on elected and unelected. So yeah, happy to hope people want to buy it.
Okay.
Just search Front Lines of Democracy election officials, you'll find it.
Excellent, great. And then where would so if I wanted to get access to these data, I send an email to the both of you, or how does one proceed?
Yeah, at this point, it's email to either me or Paul. Looping back to the question you asked, Mike, about research ideas. One thing to think about if you have a project that's in a state or a region or a particular subset of election officials, while we are unlikely to be able to run the data just for you because we have to think hard about, we have differential response rates in states. What we can do, and this, the Bipartisan Policy Center, so Rachel Ori kind of put this idea in our head. We sort of had the idea, but Rachel was at an association meeting and said, hey, I'd like to ask a subset of your questions at the meeting. We were like, great idea, because you run yours, and then we can compare your responses to ours. And so there is at least one other project that we've had some conversations with that is doing a deeper dive into a particular subset of LEOs. And I said, you could do a pre-test with them and ask some of our questions, and then we can compare their response set to our response set, right? So you don't actually need to touch our data, but what we can do is provide a broader context of what you're doing and maybe help inform either be qualitative interviews or case studies of individual jurisdictions. So we're trying to encourage people to think creatively in that way as well.
Excellent. So Manson, is there anything that you wanted to raise or talk about that we haven't covered already?
No, this has been great. I appreciate the invitation to be here. The only other thing I would share is, we focused on the local election official survey. We have another parallel project going on, Paul and I and a team of grad students, where we're now doing in-depth interviews. I think we've got over 50 interviews completed across the US. And these are a lot of the folks we're interviewing are individuals who took the survey and opted into a list to be followed up with. And we're exploring more of these hiring challenges that Paul mentioned and some of the budget and structural pieces as well. And, as a survey researcher, what I love is doing the in-depth interviews. I joke that it immediately humbles me on all of the bad choices I made in writing questions and doing the analysis. So really fun, and for those who've done in-depth interviews, the fun challenge now is that we have 50, 60, 70 hours of conversations that are really insightful, but so different. And so across the US, this sort of varying ecosystem of election laws and rules, and even within states, sort of the large urban centers versus the rural communities, it's just great to have that richness that only a qualitative project can give you sometimes.
Oh, that's exciting. Look forward to seeing some of those results. That'll be cool. Gronke, last word, anything you wanted to add that we haven't talked about?
Sure. One small thing to add on to the Homeric epic. I mean, really, I'm proud to be here and honored. And the reason I did the dive, Mike, as I talked to you before when we prepped, is the folks who were around after 2000 who said you, me, Charles Stewart, Lana Atkinson, others are getting near retirement age, may have moved on to other things, and I worry a little bit about the history of that period being forgotten. So I'll just mention one name. You and I talked about Richard Smolka. I was writing a lit review for another project recently, and I was trying to identify some of the foundational work prior to 2000 in election administration because there wasn't a lot of it. And I knew Richard Smolko's work was out there. He's at American University. For 40 years, he edited something called the Election Administration Report. He written a number of books on cost of elections, on the impact of EDR. These came out in the mid-70s. And Mike, I could not find those books anywhere. They have not been digitized as far as I can tell, the election administration. So sort of a call, I'll put it out on email, but actually if anybody knows that there's an archive at American University or anywhere. So that's the only reason I do that, is that the time is growing short in the next decade for you and I and others to kind of write the history of that period, so that folks remember, because we don't want to, we want to learn those lessons, and it's time to write that stuff down. So that's the reason for Homer. I'm still reading Homer, right?
No, it's a great place to end, because I couldn't agree with you more. And we will have to talk offline about how we can go about doing that, because I do think that there is an institutional history here.
I mean, somebody created the first academic research center with two academic institutions. I think that was two presidents who got together at Caltech and MIT, right? We want to make sure that story's out there, so people, that's a model in a lot of ways. And you're also around here 25 years later, so it's good to see.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for joining me today. And again, thanks so much for the incredibly valuable work that you're doing for the community and collecting these data. And again, I look forward to seeing more, and I look forward to seeing you both in person soon at some point.
Yeah.
All right, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. It's great.
Yeah.
All right, take care.